Hi everyone. Today's lecture is on cognitive dissonance theory, and it is our last theory of persuasion. During the lecture today, we're going to talk about what is cognitive dissonance. It's probably a term that you're already familiar with, but I'm going to make sure that we have a definition that we are all kind of working from together. And I'm also going to try to talk a little bit about how this concept is really related to persuasion and how cognitive dissonance can really motivate people to shift attitudes and change behaviors. In addition to just defining the term cognitive dissonance, I'll talk a little bit about the theory and how it suggests ways people attempt to reduce cognitive dissonance. And then also I'll talk some about how we can take all of this theoretical knowledge and hopefully use it, kind of practically apply it to be more effective at persuasion. So let's jump right in. All right, so again, I wanted to start with the definition of cognitive dissonance. When we talk about cognitive dissonance, what we're really talking about is this kind of distressing mental state that's caused by an inconsistency between your beliefs and your actions, or sometimes just two different beliefs. So we tend to like stability and consistency, as Cialdini points out. When we experience competing ideas in our head, or when we have one set of beliefs in our head, but our actions are contradictory to that set of beliefs, we experience this dissonance, this tension. It makes us feel uncomfortable. It stresses us out. Sometimes that's subconscious, but it's a distressing state that we attempt to alleviate. Right? So at this point, you may be wondering why I have a picture of these little aliens on the slide. And I have those there just to remind me to share with you the story of how cognitive dissonance theory was originated. As you saw a couple slides ago, cognitive dissonance theory is originated by Dr. Leon Festinger. So in the 1950s, Festinger was developing some of his ideas, and he was actually involved with studying a group called the Seekers. The Seekers was a kind of cult-like group that was based out of Chicago, and their primary belief was that the world was going to end, but they were going to be saved by a group of aliens because they were true believers. So essentially, they predicted on a date in December there would be a massive flooding, and again, the entire world would be devastated. But only true believers would be saved by this alien ship that arrived and beamed them up and took them to safety. So anyway, Festinger was involved in studying this group and was able to kind of be a participant observer and learn about their beliefs and their behaviors. And he watched them as they prepared for this big event. Members of the group sold their houses, they quit their jobs, they got rid of all of their possessions. They did everything I guess you would imagine someone would do who thought the world was getting ready to end. They would be no longer living on Earth. So, December moves along and the big day approaches, and all the members of the cult gather together and they're waiting and they're preparing, and all of a sudden it's midnight and the day has passed and no aliens came. And so you can imagine the group was, distraught, or at least initially uncertain of what in the world was going on. So they looked around at their leader. They came up with explanations for why no one came. They hypothesized that it was a time change issue, that they just needed to wait until it was midnight in California, and so on and so on. Well, hours later, of course, it became really clear that there was no flood, there were no aliens, and they were still here. Well, here's where things get really interesting and how this theory of cognitive dissonance really emerged. After this event, Festinger assumed that people would say, oh my gosh, we were wrong. I mean, clearly the evidence supported the idea. No aliens came, no flood occurred. But that's not what happened. The group didn't admit being wrong. The group didn't back down on their ideas. In fact, the very opposite happened. The group became even more persistent in their beliefs and felt even more strongly that, in fact, they were right. They were the seekers. They were the true believers. And so you may be thinking to yourself, well, how could that even be, right? Their belief didn't come true. Well, Fessinger kind of worked this out by developing this idea of cognitive dissonance. His argument was that this group did, their behaviors were consistent with the idea that aliens were coming. They sold all their positions. They quit all their jobs. Why would they do that if their belief was wrong, right? Who would do that? Who would change their entire life and put stock in something that wasn't true? That's cognitive dissonance, right? That would really cause a distressing mental state. So what they had to do was either change their behavior, which they couldn't, right? They couldn't go back and get their houses back, get their jobs back, or they had to change their belief. So what they wound up doing was saying, oh, we just got the date wrong, right? In fact, this is a sign. We are just being put to the test, but we passed the test, right? Our beliefs are even stronger. We did exactly what we were supposed to do. We proved that we're true believers, and this D-Day will, in fact, be coming down the road. So anyway, I hope that's an example to you to help you not only kind of better understand how the theory originated, but also better understand this idea of cognitive dissonance and the powerful things that play in our mind that help us to kind of reduce any kind of tension we experience when our beliefs and our actions don't necessarily align. Okay. On this next slide, I have a visual that kind of represents this process. Now, we might not all find ourselves in a situation where we somehow kind of have to justify beliefs in aliens and the end of the world, but on a very regular basis, we do tend to experience cognitive dissonance, right? It's not at all uncommon to experience inconsistency between our actions and our behaviors. And so we have to figure out what to do with that, right? Let me just give you a couple of examples, but while I'm doing that, I hope you think about some of your own maybe personal examples of when you've experienced some cognitive dissonance, right? To be honest, in my own personal life, one of the examples that I thought of was that I tend to think of myself as someone who's pretty environmentally conscious, right? I am aware of and believe in climate change. I try to engage in behaviors that I think help take care of the planet. I think that's important. And those types of things, right? So I have kind of this environmentally conscious set of beliefs. On the other hand, however, I also tend to be kind of addicted to Diet Coke, and I particularly like McDonald's Diet Cokes. Like if any of you probably do as well. If you like fountain drinks, you know that McDonald's has the best ones. So I often find myself at the drive-thru getting a Coke. Well, one of the very worst things for the environment we've learned is plastic straws, styrofoam cups, and so on. So I've kind of got some inconsistency here, right? I believe in helping the environment, doing what I can to not leave a big footprint. Yet on the other hand, I engage in this behavior that it creates a lot of trash and waste for the environment. So somehow I have to kind of make sense of that, right? And we'll talk about the procedures that people use to do that. At work, you may also experience some cognitive dissonance, right? We have some people working in HR as part of this class, right? Imagine a situation where you were asked to fire an employee, but you didn't feel like you were given just cause, right? So on one hand, you had to engage in the behavior and you had to let someone go, but on the other hand, your belief was maybe that wasn't right or that was unfair. That's some dissonance, right? Somehow you have to figure that out. Likely what's going to happen is either you're going to convince yourself that that person actually did do something that deserved to be fired, right? So now your belief and your action are consistent. Or perhaps you're going to tell yourself, you know what, actually letting that person go was for the greater good and the betterment of the company. And so although it may have been unfair to that particular individual, it was good for the overall organization, right? Again, now you've kind of reduced the tension or the contradiction between your beliefs and your behaviors. Right? So those are a couple of examples, but I hope you're thinking through some of your own examples as well, right? So when you experience dissonance in your personal life, at work, you attempt to reduce that feeling, that distressing mental state. Often we do this kind of in our subconscious. We may not even realize we're doing it. But basically you have three options, right? One thing you can do is you could change your beliefs, right? Change the way you think. In my case, I could tell myself, you know what, I don't really care about the environment. I am really not someone who is too worried about it. It's not that big of a deal. And so therefore my behavior of, using plastic straws and drinking from styrofoam cups no longer becomes that inconsistency. Okay, so changing beliefs is one option for reducing dissonance. Another option is you can actually change your behaviors, right? You can stop doing the behavior that's inconsistent with your beliefs. And so here's another example, right? I also, in my personal life, right, like to think of myself as a pretty healthy person. Again, I've got that Diet Coke habit, so maybe that's an issue there. But I like to think of myself as someone who takes care of themselves, right, eats right, exercises. Sometimes my behavior doesn't match that, right? Sometimes there's some inconsistency there, right? So, at the start of the new year, when we're all making resolutions and things like that, when I'm particularly committed to this idea of, a healthy new year and a healthy new me, then I change my action, right? I find myself being much more consistent with exercise and working quite a bit, right? So changing actions is another way to make sure action and belief are consistent and there's no dissonance. Finally, the third option there you can see at the bottom of the chart suggests in order to reduce dissonance, you can change action perception, right? What that means is you could change the way you think about your actions. So you're keeping the same beliefs and you're keeping the same behaviors in this case, but in this case now you think differently about that behavior. If we go to my exercise example, right? So again, remember, let's say I have the belief that I'm a healthy person who takes care of herself, but my current behavior is that I don't really exercise that often, and I'm not going to change that. But I could change my perception of that action. I could tell myself, you know what, exercise is really not that important, right? Or I could tell myself, you know what, I actually don't need to go exercise at the gym. I walk a lot of steps and I walk up and down flight stairs. That really actually is exercise, and that's pretty good for me. So I'm not really changing my belief. I'm not really changing my action, but I'm changing the way I think about those actions. And so those tend to be the three different ways that we attempt to reduce dissonance. Again, as you are kind of thinking about this lecture and you were doing your reading, I encourage you to think about your own personal examples of dissonance, both maybe at home as well as at work. One more thing I want to say about the slide also is that I hope that you're thinking about this theory and thinking about how it really does, I think, pair well with Cialdini's idea of commitment and consistency. Right? Although Cialdini never really refers to a theory or cognitive dissonance specifically, he does point out that humans tend to act in a way that represents consistent behaviors, right? His whole argument when he's talking about this particular level of influence is that we like to commit to something and then we like to stick with that, right? This theory does such a good job of explaining why that is, right? So again, I just want you to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, not only as we're listening to the lecture, but also as you're doing the reading, right? Cognitive dissonance really can help us better understand that kind of click-run pattern of consistency or commitment. Okay, let me go ahead and move on. In the next couple of slides here, now what I have is some of the mental mechanisms that the theory suggests we use in order to reduce the cognitive dissonance we experience when our actions and our behaviors are inconsistent. According to the theory, we try some of these strategies. We try something called selective exposure. We use post-dissonance reassurance, and we also do something called minimal justification. I'm going to actually use one slide to describe each one of these. So let me advance to the next one here. Let me go ahead now and talk about selective exposure. You're probably already pretty familiar with this idea and have heard about it in other ways, right? But when we apply the idea of selective exposure to cognitive dissonance theory, what we're talking about is the fact that people tend to avoid information that is incompatible with their beliefs, right? Or in other words, any info that would create dissonance. So certainly one of the best examples to think of when we think of selective exposure is when it comes to politics, right? We know that in this day and age, people who tend to have more conservative beliefs, people who tend to identify more with the Republican Party are much more likely to watch Fox News or other types of sources like that. On the other hand, people who tend to be more liberal or identify with the Democratic Party are much more likely to watch like CNN or MSNBC. Right? And the reason for that is because when you watch, if you were to watch shows that did not reaffirm your existing beliefs, right, and you flip-flopped, then you would experience this dissonance, right? You would be getting information that is inconsistent with your beliefs, right? So what we do instead is we avoid that, right? We selectively expose ourselves only to the info that already reaffirms those existing beliefs. stepping away from the political example, I'll give you another example here. To be honest, I tend to do this again with my Diet Coke addiction, right? And it feels like every year or so, more studies come out about just how awful this drink is for me. And that soda in general is bad, but aspartame in particular is terrible. And I'll scroll through my social media, I'll be listening to the news, and I can tell you when those stories come on, I really do not pay attention, right? I do not take time to actually read through all that data because I don't want to hear it, right? Because if I really do believe that Diet Coke is terrible for me and I pay attention to all these unfortunate side effects, then all of a sudden I've got a problem here if I continue to drink Diet Coke, right? I've got some significant cognitive dissonance. Okay, so that's an easy one, I think, to sort through. You guys, again, are probably already familiar with that idea. Let's do this one. I think it's also pretty straightforward. Another thing that we sometimes do is engage in post-dissonance reassurance. So what the theory argues is that people tend to seek reassurance after they make any kind of big decision, right? Essentially, what we're trying to do is reaffirm that we made the right decision, right? We don't want to feel like we made this one decision, but then find out it was wrong, right? Because, of course, that creates dissonance. So how do we do that? Well, we go find information that confirms that decision. Have you ever noticed if maybe you've made a big purchase, maybe a car purchase or some kind of appliance, and after you've already made that purchase and you're already invested, you actually are still going on Consumer Reports or you are still reading reviews for the car or the appliance? I thought, what am I doing? I already made my purchase. Well, the theory argues what you're doing is you're trying to get post-decision reassurance, right? You're trying to eliminate any doubt you have or concern that you made the wrong decision and reassure yourself that, yep, you made the right call. We are most likely to engage in this process when we are making a certain type of decision, right? If it's a really important issue, like picking where you were going to go to college, right? Or trying to select which job to take. Those are big deals, right? They're really important issues. You probably took a long time making that decision. And the third part there is really important. It's a decision that's going to be really hard to reverse, right? If you pick one school and decide that you don't want to go there, it's challenging to have to transfer and have to regroup and all of that. So under those conditions, we are most likely to engage in this process to make sure that we don't experience dissonance. We don't feel like we made the wrong choice, but instead we find that information that really reassures us and makes us feel like, yep, we did make the right choice. Okay, our final behavior that the theory says we use in order to reduce any dissonance we might experience is called minimal justification. So basically what this says is the best way to get someone to change their mind or to shift their attitude is to offer just enough incentive to get them to change a behavior. Okay? So if you offer someone just a very little incentive, but it's enough to get them to change their behavior, now what they have going on here is this behavior that is one thing, but a belief that the pre-existing belief that is inconsistent, now they have dissonance, right? And so as we said, now they have a choice to make, right? And often what will happen is people will now go on to change those beliefs. One of the original studies by Fessinger does a great job of illustrating just what this minimal justification process looks like. So if you go into the module and you do the exercise on cognitive dissonance, you'll see that there's like a 5-minute video that shows you this kind of black and white study of people engaging in minimal justification. So it's a really good illustration of this concept, and I think it will really help it kind of explain exactly what I am trying to talk about. Right. With that being said, I'll just give you one more example and then I'll move on. One thing we know that's kind of surprising at first, at least, is that a lot of times we actually find, we find surprising relationships between the salary that people earn and their job satisfaction. In fact, there's often a correlation between receiving a kind of low salary or low compensation and higher job satisfaction. And then the reverse is true. People who get paid more maybe document being less satisfied with your job. Right? Again, that seems kind of counterintuitive, right? We tend to assume, well, the more money you make, the happier you are. Well, we can use cognitive dissonance theory to understand what's going on here, right? According to the theory, what we would explain would be that if you are not receiving very good compensation for your job, right? Maybe a lot of us in communication related fields or public affairs types of fields can relate to that, right? If you're not receiving a very high salary, then it's not the salary that justifies why you're there, right? You can't use the money as a reason to say, this is why I'm in my job. You have to come up with something else, right? So you have to convince yourself or say to yourself, I'm here because I love my job. Screw the salary. Who cares about the money? I'm here because I really love my job. So I think that explains that, right? Interestingly enough, a lower salary is actually correlated to higher job satisfaction. On the other hand, people who make large salaries and receive really high compensation don't have to do that, right? They don't have to justify in their head why they're sticking around with their job. They can say to themselves, I hate my job, but I'm making so much money that that's why I'm here, that I have to stay, right? So there's no dissonance there. So anyway, I think that's kind of an interesting, another way to think about this idea of minimal justification. Okay. And also related to that is something I want you to think about in terms of considering this kind of new sequence for getting people to shift their attitude, right? Cognitive dissonance kind of flips some traditional beliefs about attitude change and persuasion on its head. I think typically we assume you have to get someone to change their attitude before you change their behavior, right? Think about maybe smoking as an example. We assume that what we have to do is we have to convince someone that smoking is terrible for them and show them all kinds of evidence about how bad smoking is. And surely once they see that, any logical person would say, well, I'm never going to smoke again, right? But I don't know about you. If any of the rest of you have ever had a member of the family that is a smoker, you know that that does not work, right? My dad smoked for years, and I can tell you that I've tried that approach ineffectively over and over and over again, right? I think that also relates to my Diet Coke example, right? At some level, I know Diet Coke is bad for me. I get it, but I still engage in the behavior. So cognitive dissonance theory says, let's flip that, right? What actually might be more, or what actually is more effective for getting people to shift their attitudes is to first shift their behavior, right? So in the smoking example, if you can get someone to not smoke for a day, now all of a sudden they can actually say, oh, well, I am kind of a non-smoker, right? Or at least I am a non-smoker for today. Maybe I could be a non-smoker tomorrow as well, and then build on that. And then eventually they come to not smoke for weeks and truly think of themselves as a non-smoker, right? Several of the examples in your book, I think, also really represent this pattern, right? Schledini summarizes study after study that shows people acting in a certain way or engaging in a certain behavior, right? Like signing the text that says, yep, I will be coming to my doctor's appointment, right? And then, okay, they believe that they intend to go and they actually go, right? Or the study, one of the ones I think was really interesting was the study that was at the beach, right? If you recall, in that particular study, what they did was they had members, researchers, leave a towel and a boombox next to a beachgoer. And in the first instance, what happened was the researcher left his boombox unattended, and someone, right, another researcher, came along and stole it, and the other beachgoers that were nearby did nothing. But in the second version, they did the same thing, except before the researcher left, they said, hey, would you mind watching this for me? And the beachgoer said, well, sure, yeah, I can watch it for you. The fact that the beachgoer in that case committed to or kind of engaged in this behavior of like what a friend would say or a friend would do, when the thieves came along in that second version of the study, the beachgoers actually intervened, right? They actually got up and tried to stop someone from taking the beach box, right? Because they started with this behavior, right, that said, well, yeah, I'm a friend of this person, right, or I'm a good Samaritan. And so based on that, then they had to actually believe that or engage in that, you follow through with that, right? So again, I just think this is a really interesting way to kind of shift our thinking, which at first feels kind of counterintuitive, but once you unpack it, I think makes a lot of sense. So this is one more thing that I encourage you to think more about, right? And think about not only in your personal life, but at work. How might you utilize this new knowledge to perhaps influence or persuade some of your colleagues or your stakeholders? Okay, And to kind of wrap things up then, right, and kind of take all of these ideas of cognitive dissonance along with these different mechanisms of selective exposure and post-dissonance reassurance and minimal justification, and kind of put all that together, here are just a couple of examples that are ways that we can use this info and apply it to maybe enhance our ability to be persuasive. The first strategy I have there suggests how important it is to really try to create warm interpersonal relationships. This kind of also harkens back to some of the things we learned from Carnegie's book. But the argument now is that, again, people are much more willing to accept information from friends and others that they like, right? And so if someone sees you as being similar to them and on the same side, right, then you're going to be able to kind of avoid that potential problem with selective exposure, right? So rather than highlighting any differences, or whether that's political belief differences or differences in terms of work beliefs or whatever, right? Rather than highlight those things, instead, focus on similarities, focus on building this friendship, and at least according to cognitive dissonance, the people you're trying to influence are going to act in ways that are consistent with how you would act towards a friend, right? They're going to be more willing to listen. They're going to be more willing to, take your suggestions and so on. Okay. Okay, so that's one thing, right? Think about ways in which you can just kind of from the get-go foster interpersonal relationships. The next advice from cognitive dissonance is to think about ways to get others to perform counter-attitudinal actions. All that really means is think about ways to get people to engage in a behavior that is consistent with the belief that you want them to have. And so if they do the behavior first, as we just discussed, then that dissonance that comes from that behavior is going to help you kind of help them shift their attitude. Okay. I gave an example of this in my, again, in one of the exercises. And to be perfectly honest, I kind of forgot that I had this policy that I used to use at the beginning of the semester, but reading back through this book reminded me. I used to always have my students take the syllabus home on day one and ask them to read through it, and then I would always have them sign the syllabus and bring it back. And I think this theory provides a lot of justification for why that's valuable, right? So what happens there is the individual is engaged in a behavior that's consistent with being a strong student, right? They're engaged in this activity. They are writing down, they are saying, yep, I am a good student. I will follow these rules, right? So once I have that commitment, as Cialdini would say, as we move forward throughout the semester, it's going to create dissonance when maybe, you get tired, you get kind of worn out throughout the semester, but it's going to create more dissonance in the students if they start to think, oh, this class really isn't that important, or I don't really need to do that homework, right? Because at least initially there was kind of that initial commitment and that initial behavior that came from the act of signing the syllabi and agreeing to those policies. So again, in the exercise, I ask you to think of a lot of different ways that you can actually practically apply these ideas. So that's just one example, but I'm hopeful and I'm looking forward to seeing some of your examples as well. Okay. And then finally, the last advice is just think about ways to enable individuals to follow those click-run patterns of consistency, right? Even as simple as the study that said asking someone how they're doing and getting them to say, I'm doing well, that went on to lead people to be more likely to donate and help people that they perceive to not be doing well or needing charity, right? Even something as simple as that is a way to persuade individuals to follow this consistency pattern, even if they don't realize what's happening, right? But you do, because you have this new knowledge. Okay. Okay, well, I'm right about the 30-minute mark, so I think I will stop there. But again, I hope that you found this theory interesting and relevant, and I encourage you to really think about how cognitive dissonance relates, well, to all of the levers, but certainly to this lever of commitment and consistency. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.